Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are cracking open a really fascinating stack of source material.
We certainly are.
We're diving into how religious scholars wrestle with some of the most profound questions of language and, well, metaphysics. Things like, how do you describe the divine without accidentally limiting it or distorting it or comparing it to creation?
It's a fundamental challenge.
And this entire investigation focuses on what are known as shubhات, those theological ambiguities or misconceptions that come up when you misinterpret sacred texts.
Indeed. Our mission today is purely analytical, and it requires, well, absolute rigor.
Right.
We are dissecting specific claims about the nature and attributes of God. And these claims, they often hinge on just a single word or phrase taken literally, completely divorced from its theological context.
So we really need to unpack the scholarly methodologies they use to respond to them.
We do, thoroughly.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. When we read ancient scripture, we often find descriptions of the divine using terms that are, familiar to human experience.
Of course.
Yeah.
Things like speaking, seeing, having hands.
Exactly, or even descriptions related to creatures. And this creates a fundamental tension. So how do scholars manage that? How do they balance the required perfection of God against the descriptive language they find in the text?
Well, that is the central challenge. It's navigating the tension between simply accepting a text's literal meaning and upholding the absolute principle of divine transcendence.
Divine transcendence.
Known as tanzi. Tanzi means declaring God far, far above any resemblance or comparison or likeness to creation. So if a text attributes an action or a quality to God, that attribution must be affirmed, but at the same time.
You have to negate any implication of creaturely likeness.
You must. That error is known as tashbih.
So, okay, affirm the description, but deny the comparison. And to manage that affirmation without likeness, the sources rely heavily on differentiating two categories of divine reference.
Yes, sifat and idafa.
And these are foundational for today's discussion.
They are absolutely critical. Sifat are God's inherent attributes, things like knowledge or ilm, power, quadra, life, hayat, speech, kalam.
So the non-created eternal quality.
Exactly. They belong to the divine essence. Idafa, on the other hand, means attribution, usually by way of ownership or honor or creation or even metaphor.
So these are created things.
Yes, created entities that are attributed to God for some kind of specialized veneration or distinction.
I see the dividing line there. The inherent qualities are eternal, but the attributed items are created. And if you confuse the two,
you run into serious problems.
You either try to inject created limitations into the divine essence, or you end up elevating a created thing to the level of divinity.
Precisely. Ibn Taymiyyah, whose work is just central to these responses, he stresses this distinction as a towering theological principle. He noted that the confusion between an inherent non-created attribute, a sifa, and an attribute by way of creation or ownership, an idafa, is a historical error that has caused profound theological deviations across various faiths.
So our framework for this entire deep dive will be rooted in clarifying that distinction.
It has to be.
Okay, let's immediately dive into the first misconception, which is certainly a striking one. It's highly provocative. It deals with a claim that comes from a prophetic saying that implies God possesses a created creature.
Specifically a dog.
Yes, which leads to a critique of the divine nature itself.
This claim originates from an anecdote about Utbah ibn Abi Lahab, who was an opponent of the Prophet Muhammad. The report states that after Utbah openly expressed his disbelief and his hostility, the Prophet prayed, saying, God will send upon him a dog from his dogs.
And the outcome of that prayer is it's a terrifying story.
It is. Utbah was later traveling, and while he was in a place reportedly populated by lions, his companions grew nervous. They recognized the implication of the prophet's prayer.
They knew something was coming.
They did. And a lion and Assad tracked their group, reportedly smelling the heads of Utbah's companions one by one before singling out Utbah and killing him.
So the critics, they seize on that phrase, dog from his dogs, which contrasts with the actual agent of death, which was a lion.
Exactly. And this immediately forces us back to that principle of attribution we just discussed.
Idafa.
Yes. The first scholarly response validates the attribution. It says whatever God attributes to himself or his prophet attributes to him is affirmed. But
strictly without likeness to creation, without tashbih.
Correct. The lion, in this case, is one of God's created creatures, and it's performing God's decree. The reference to God's dogs is understood as an attribution of ownership and specialized creation.
Not a divine attribute itself.
Not at all. God is the creator and master of all creatures, and sometimes one of them receives a specialized attribution to either give it distinction or to signify it is acting under a direct divine command.
Can you give us some of those classical examples of specialized idafa, just to make the distinction crystal clear for everyone listening?
Of course. There are several examples rooted in the foundational texts. You have Naquat Allah God's she-camel, which refers to the camel of the prophet Salih.
Right.
Then there's Beit Allah God's house, referring to the Kaaba in Mecca.
I see.
We also find Ard Allah, which is God's earth, and famously Ruh Allah, God's spirit, which often refers to the angel Gabriel or the spirit breathed into Mary or Adam.
So these are all created entities. The Kaaba was built, the camel was born, the spirit was created.
Yes, they are Ayan, created entities, but the attribution of God is used for holiness and honor.
I think I understand the principle of idafa for something like the Kaaba.
Yeah.
It's an object of honor. But isn't there a risk here? I mean, if scholars just interpret every sensitive attribution metaphorically, where do you draw the line? How do they avoid, arbitrary reinterpretation?
That is the precise intellectual challenge, and the line is drawn based on whether the reference is to an inherent eternal quality, a sifat, or a created entity, an ayan.
Okay.
As Ibn Taymiyyah taught, attributes like knowledge, power, or life are non-created descriptions of God's essays. But created objects like a house, a camel, or even a dog or lion acting as an agent, they can't be eternal or inherent to God.
Because if they were,
God would be subject to created limitations. So the affirmation is confined to saying, this is a created thing belonging to God, and that's how transcendence is maintained.
I see. So it's not really about making a description metaphorical. It's about correctly classifying the subject of the description.
Is it a created object, an idafa, or is it an inherent quality, a sifat?
That is the key subtlety. And we find this complexity even in descriptions that use the name of an attribute to describe a created effect.
For instance,
the prophet mentioned that God created 100 portions of mercy, or Rama. Now, Rama, mercy, is undeniably an eternal divine attribute.
Of course.
However, when the prophet quotes God as saying to paradise, "You are my mercy, I show mercy with you," the word mercy here is referring to the created object paradise.
So it's the effect and the manifestation of the attribute, not the attribute itself.
Exactly. So the scholarly methodology requires us to affirm the attribute's existence eternally while also recognizing the created result that bears the attribute's name. It requires extremely careful theological semantics. It really does. It means every use of a divine term has to pass the test of tanzi. If it implies a limit or a likeness, it has to be understood either as an idafa of creation and honor or as the description of a created effect.
Correct.
Now, moving to the second phase of the scholarly response about the dog anecdote, there's also a critical stance on the source material itself, which is always a powerful tool in these debates.
Absolutely. Critical scholarship has to first address the text's authenticity, the isnad.
Sure.
And the specific prophetic prediction containing that exact phrase, God will send upon him a dog from his dogs, is overwhelmingly judged to be very weak, daif jiddan, or even fabricated, modu.
Why is it weak? This is vital for us to understand. Why should we disregard a historical report like this?
Well, rigorous scholarship requires sound chains of narration, and the source material here identifies multiple compromised chains.
For example,
in one chain, the narrator, Muhammad ibn Hamid, was accused by local scholars of, lying. In another, Salama ibn Nawfal was deemed generally reliable but was known to make many errors, and Muhammad ibn Ishaq was a modalis.
A modalis.
Meaning he would occasionally obscure or omit the person he heard the report from, which compromises the integrity of the whole chain.
I see.
A third chain included Al-Abbas ibn al-Fadl, who was labeled as matruk, abandoned by critics. So when a report has such compounded weakness, unreliable narrators, known fabrication, obscurity, it just can't be used to establish a theological point or critique the divine.
So the comprehensive response is just devastating to the critique. The premise is theologically misinterpreted.
Confusing sifat and idafa.
Right. And fundamentally, the anecdote itself isn't textually reliable enough to even warrant a deep discussion.
That is the nature of the formal analytical approach. You have to address both the ziyanan, the authenticity, and the matan, the content interpretation.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, because we're bringing in the comparative context. The source material gives us examples from other Abrahamic texts that use these kinds of creaturely similes to describe the divine.
It does.
And this really underscored that this kind of analogical language is a universal scriptural challenge.
It's so important. When critics raise the issue of creaturely attribution as if it's a flaw unique to one tradition, it's essential to look at the broader landscape. The sources cite texts from the Christian tradition where God is described using very powerful similes.
And we have to report these descriptions impartially, just as textual facts. So what are the specific descriptions of God found in the Christian books cited by the source?
We find some really striking similes. In the book of Jeremiah, God is compared to a bear. He is to me as a bear in ambush.
A bear in ambush.
And in Hosea, the Lord speaks and says, "For I will be to Ephraim like a moth, and to the house of Judah like rot," or sus, referring to a worm or an insect causing decay. This analogy describes the destructive, sort of insidious nature of divine judgment using these tiny, weak creatures.
Comparing the divine to a moth or rot, that truly puts the necessity of maintaining divine transcendence, tanzi, into stark relief. It just shows the incredible power inherent in analogical language.
Absolutely. And the sources continue with Hosea, where God is compared to a powerful predator. "I will meet them like a lioness, like a leopard, I will lie in wait." And perhaps most evocatively, in Micah, the prophet describes the divine as experiencing and expressing deep human-like grief. "I will howl like jackals, Benadawa."
The jackal comparison goes beyond just a creature. It projects human sorrow, wailing, and lament onto the divine. This comparative review really confirms that every religious tradition dealing with the infinite faces this linguistic difficulty of using finite, creaturely language.
It does.
It makes the rigor applied by scholars like differentiating sifat and adafa seem not just pedantic, but utterly necessary. So that addresses the problem of describing God using external creatures. But the next misconception, it touches on something even more challenging: attributing human deficiency.
Things like illness or hunger.
Exactly. Attributing that to the divine. This relates directly back to the Eilaaf principle, but in a more rhetorical sense.
Correct. The claim is based on a literal reading of a hadith Qudsi, which is a divine saying. God begins, "O son of Adam, I became ill and you did not visit me, and I asked you for food and you did not feed me."
Now, if you take that literally, that would attribute human frailty, physical sickness, hunger, need to the divine, which completely contradicts the perfection required by tanzi.
It does. But here's where the text's genius lies. The hadith Qudsi is self-interpreting. It resolves the ambiguity within the same dialogue.
Yeah, so
God provides the immediate clarification. When the servant expresses utter confusion, asking, "Oh Lord, how could I visit you? And you are the Lord of the worlds, far above such things," God responds by stating the true subject.
He reframes it.
He says, "Did you not know that my servant so-and-so was ill and you did not visit him? Did you not know that if you had visited him, you would have found me with him?" And the same explanatory structure applies to the references to hunger and thirst.
So the attribution of sickness and hunger to God is purely an elevated rhetorical device.
Yes.
It's intended to magnify the importance of caring for the vulnerable.
It's the highest possible form of honorific attribution. Scholars explain that this is a means by which the master speaks of the wali, the close friend, or the pious believer, by attributing the servant's state to himself. It's an idafa of immense closeness and honor.
Not an idafa of necessity or inherent quality.
Not at all. And the purpose is encouragement, Targib, to motivate people toward charity and compassion by linking the act of service directly to God's presence.
That makes perfect sense. By saying, "You would have found me with him," God elevates the physical act of visiting the sick or feeding the hungry to a spiritual act of seeking the divine presence.
That is the theological purpose.
What's fascinating here is the defensive mechanism embedded in this interpretation. The source material notes that this interpretation explicitly refutes certain extreme theological errors. How does it do that?
Because the explanation insists upon the separation of creator and created. By clearly stating, "My servant so-and-so was ill," the interpretation definitively refutes the doctrine of incarnation, or hulu.
The belief that the divine essence resides within a created being.
Correct. And it also refutes monistic unity, Ittihad, the idea that the creator and creation are ultimately one. The language establishes a clear differentiation between the Lord and the servant, even while conferring this immense honor.
So it's a structural clarity.
Yes. Ibn Taymiyyah points out that the finding is one of proximity by faith and spiritual presence, not physical union.
Affirming the honor while denying the likeness. That is absolutely vital for maintaining transcendence. Okay, now let's address the final sensitive claim in this section, Shubha 9, the water of resurrection. Critics claimed the water God sends down to resurrect humanity is his semen.
This specific claim is a direct result of relying on an extremely weak, ambiguous source. When you're dealing with eschatology, with the end times, you have to rely only on the soundest reports.
So what does the authentic tradition state about the resurrection process and the water involved?
The authentic hadith, narrated by Abu Huraira, confirms that after the 2 trumpet blasts, God sends down water from the sky, and people regrow like vegetation from the bone known as the Ojbi al-Dhanab.
The Cossacks or tailbones?
Critically, this sound narration describes the process using natural imagery, rain, and plant growth.
So where did the claim about semen even enter the discussion?
The specific phrase, like the semen of men, is found only in a weak, singular report attributed to Ibn Masud. Scholars deem this particular report inauthentic. It's contradictory to the general body of sound eschatological texts which describe the water as al-tal, or all-hill dew, or shade.
So the claim is rejected on grounds of authenticity.
Correct.
But let's just play the hypothetical for a moment. If a source did describe the water as having a resemblance to semen, how would the theology still apply that Edafa principle?
Well, even if the water were described as resembling semen, the source stresses that this water is fundamentally created by God. It is an object.
It's not derived from his essence, his dad.
No. God demonstrates his boundless power by creating a resemblance in nature. He created semen in men, and he can create water that looks like it without any necessary similarity to himself. The resemblance belongs to creation, and his power encompasses that creation.
I see.
Again, the absolute necessity of divine transcendence ensures that created resemblance does not imply divine likeness.
Okay, part 2, transitions from creaturely descriptions to the grand cosmic scale of the divine. We're focusing on the greatest entity in creation, the throne, Al-Arsh. The misconception here, Shubha 2, is that the throne is supported by 8 angels in the form of specific animals.
The precise claim involves the bearers having the forms of an ibex or whale, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. This is often derived from symbolic descriptions found in religious iconography.
Right. And the Quranic basis for the number of bearers is clear in Surah Al-Haqqa.
It is. And 8 will bear the throne of your Lord above them that day.
So the number 8 is affirmed in the Revelation. But what are the 2 primary interpretations of what 8 actually refers to?
Early scholars differed slightly on this. Some, like Ibn Abbas and Sayyid ibn Jubair, interpreted 8 as referring to 8 rows or types of angels whose exact number only God knows.
So it conveys an overwhelming number.
Yes. Others, however, affirmed 8 individual angels, and they cited specific prophetic traditions describing their physical reality.
And those authentic traditions convey a scale that's just. It's utterly beyond our physical comprehension. Remind us of the sheer immensity of these individual bearers.
The established tradition, narrated by Jabir, is staggering. It describes one of the angel bearers, stating that the distance between its earlobe and its shoulder is a journey of 700 years.
700 years.
If you try to extrapolate that over the known scale of the universe, it establishes a creature of just incomprehensible mass and size. It signifies the gravity and magnitude of the entity they bear.
Now let's address the animal forms, the lion, bull, eagle, and ibex. Since these forms are such widespread symbols of power in ancient cultures, what is the rigorous scholarly assessment of the traditions claiming the angels have these shapes?
The source material here is unequivocal. The traditions describing the angels as having these animal shapes are judged by hadith specialists as weak, daif, or even fabricated modu.
So they're rejected.
They are. For instance, specific narrations linking the bearers to these animal figures are traced back to known unreliable storytellers or individuals whose reports were deemed abandoned or matruk. Therefore, the claim about animal forms is rejected, and it preserves the mystery of the angel's true appearance.
The scale of the cosmos itself provides context here. Let's ground the discussion by recalling the relationship between the throne and the kursi, the footstool.
The scale is essential for grasping the significance of the throne. The prophet compared the relationship of the 7 heavens to the kursi, which is usually defined as the footstool of God, to that of a small ring thrown into a desolate desert.
So the desert is the size of the kursi.
Yes, that immense vacuum represents the kursi. Then the superiority of the throne over the kursi is likened to the superiority of that same desolate desert over the tiny ring it contains.
That establishes the throne as the greatest, most immense created entity in existence.
By an unimaginable margin.
Okay, let's move to the deeper theological debates about the throne's function, starting with the basic definition.
Linguistically, al-arsh simply means a bed or a couch relative to what is above it, or a ceiling relative to what is beneath it.
And theologically.
Theologically, throne of your Lord is, again, an idafa of specialization. It signifies that this entity is uniquely related to God, not a creation shared in the same way as the earth or the sky.
Now, the most intensely debated concept is istawa, often translated as God's ascension or settlement or establishment upon the throne. We have 7 Quranic references confirming this. What exactly did the early scholars, the Salaf, understand this action to mean?
The consensus among the early generations and the scholars of al-Hadith defined istawa as an affirmation of rising, ascent, stability, and highness. Interpreters like Mujahid explicitly said istawa meant God ascended, Allah above the throne.
So they affirmed the literal action.
This view holds that God, after creating the heavens and earth, settled upon the throne, affirming the literal action stated in the text.
But affirming a literal action seems immediately problematic if you're trying to avoid tashbih comparison. How do they reconcile this literal affirmation with the principle of transcendence?
They reconcile it through a crucial qualifier, bila kayf.
Meaning, without asking how.
Exactly. Without asking how and without likeness to creation, they insisted the action is unique to God. For instance, God's istawa doesn't involve moving from one created place to another, nor does it imply a physical body settling on an object like a human sits on a chair.
So it's an act affirmed exactly as described.
But its mode or manner is beyond human comprehension, and this protects transcendence while upholding the veracity of the text.
That distinction is key. Now, what about the contrasting interpretations? The source cites a major opposing view.
The first view, which is common among rationalist theologians, the Mutakalimon, prefers to interpret istawa metaphorically.
How so?
They argue it simply means God's complete authority, his control, or his sovereignty is still over the throne. They hold that affirming any literal settlement implies that God experiences change or movement, which they deem impossible for the divine essence.
So for them, interpreting istawa metaphorically is the only way to safeguard tanzi.
That's their position. On one side, you have the rationalists prioritizing their logical conclusion of divine immutability, even if it requires a metaphor.
And on the other side?
You have the traditionalists prioritizing textual affirmation. Istawa means to settle. And they safeguard this by saying we cannot know how bila kaif.
So their principle is that God can affirm the action in the text and simultaneously transcend any human concept of movement or physical limitation.
Precisely. Their principle is simple. God knows best how he settles upon his throne, and affirming the text is safer than applying human-derived metaphors, provided that tashbih is negated.
This intense debate naturally flows into the load argument. Do the 8 throne bearers carry God, or just the throne itself? This is where critics try to imply divine need or dependence.
And the scholarly response presents 2 powerful arguments against that. The first argument rejects the necessity by analogy.
Okay.
Not everything above a bearer must be carried. For example, the air and the birds flying above a ceiling are not carried by the ceiling. The heavens above the earth are not carried by the earth.
So the angels carrying the throne doesn't logically necessitate that they carry what is above the throne.
Meaning God himself, exactly, is a very sharp logical distinction.
And what's the second argument? This one seems to affirm the possibility of bearing the divine, but entirely negates the idea of dependence.
This second argument rests entirely on divine power, qawa. Even if the throne and its bearers do carry God by God's own decree, this does not imply God needs them.
Why not?
Because God creates the bearers, their power, and their capacity to act. Ultimately, God carries himself through his own power, which is infinite. Dependence is defined by a need for an external, independent force. Since the bearers and their strength are entirely dependent on God, their action of carrying cannot imply his dependence.
The source uses a very vivid hypothetical to illustrate this concept of divine sufficiency, regardless of scale.
It does. The scholar stated that if God willed, he could settle upon the back of a small mosquito, and the mosquito would bear him.
But not by its own fragile strength.
No, but by the subtlety of God's lordship and his power. So if a mosquito can bear him by his power, the immense throne, which dwarfs the entire cosmos, must certainly bear him without implying any weakness or need on the part of the creator.
That truly turns the critique of need on its head. To ground this section, let's revisit the comparative texts. What do the descriptions of the throne found in the book of Revelation tell us?
The descriptions are highly detailed and symbolic, emphasizing the throne's majesty and power. Matthew states that heaven is God's throne and he sits upon it.
Right.
And Revelation 4 further details the throne as issuing lightning, thunder, and voices, which signifies divine judgment and power. And before the throne is a vast sea of glass like crystal and 7 lamps of fire, the 7 spirits of God.
And what about the bearers or the accompanying entities in the Christian description?
Revelation describes 4 living creatures, Hayawanat, surrounding the throne. They're full of eyes, both inside and out, and these creatures combine multiple animal and human forms.
Which forms?
One resembling a lion, one a calf or a bull, one a man, and one a flying eagle, each possessing 6 wings.
So this parallel, where great composite animal-featured entities surround the seat of divine authority, demonstrates that the symbolic representation of the throne and its guardians is a profound recurring motif throughout the Abrahamic tradition.
It is, even if the specific details differ.
Okay, part 3 shifts our focus to attributes of action and knowledge. And the claim here is profound. Critics infer from certain verses that God's knowledge of the unseen, the gaib, is incomplete, or that it's only revealed through events, particularly using the phrase so that God may know.
L'Ilama.
Right. And we must immediately establish the theological pillar here. God's knowledge is absolute, singular, and eternal. God knows all that has been, is, and will be before it occurs. There are verses to back that up.
Many. The source cites Surah Al-An'am. With him are the keys of the unseen. None knows them except him. And Surah An-Naml explicitly excludes all created beings, prophets, angels, jinn, from this unique knowledge save for what God chooses to reveal.
So if God's knowledge is perfect and eternal, how do scholars interpret that seemingly contradictory phrase, liya'lama Allah, as in the verse? So that God may know who fears him unseen.
The consensus among major early commentators like Al-Tabari is that the phrase liya'lama Allah does not mean God is acquiring new information. God knew the truth eternally.
So what does it mean?
Instead, the phrase means to make known or to make manifest the reality of a person's faith or obedience or hypocrisy to others, to the angels, to humanity, and perhaps most importantly, to the individual being tested.
Ah, so the purpose of the test, the Ibtila, is not for God to learn, but for the truth to be demonstrated empirically in the world.
Exactly. It's knowledge moving from the eternal theoretical realm to the practical manifest realm. The test is a method for distinguishing the truth teller from the liar in the realm of human experience, so that the justice of reward and punishment can be enacted.
I see. The verse saying God seeks to know those who believe and know the hypocrites means he intends to distinguish them for the world to see their actions.
That's the interpretation.
Critics also cited the historical shift in military command during the early Islamic period, the required fighting ratio changing from 1 to 10 down to 1 to 2.
Yes.
They saw this as evidence of God reacting to new information or realizing human weakness after the fact.
And this is a misinterpretation of divine legislation. The shift, which you find in Surah Al-Anfal, is interpreted not as a reaction to ignorance, but as divine alleviation or takfif.
Alleviation?
Yes. The initial, more difficult command of 1 to 10 was given based on God's eternal knowledge of their full potential. The subsequent verse was a relaxation of that duty, confirming God's foreknowledge of their inevitable daf, or weakness, their hardship under intense pressure.
So he chose to make the burden lighter out of mercy.
Correct. So the sequence actually reaffirms rather than negates perfect foreknowledge.
This leads us directly into the most contentious area of theology, the balance between God's will and human free choice. Shubha 5 claims that God calls people to immorality or depravity. And this is based on the verse. And God inspired the soul with its depravity, fujur, and its righteousness, taqwa.
The meaning of the key word, alhama, inspired or guided, is essential here. Scholars widely interpret alhama as meaning he made clear, he clarified, or he showed or distinguished the 2 paths of good and evil to the soul.
So God didn't compel the soul to choose fujur.
No, he merely defined the path, explained its consequences, and granted the innate capacity to recognize both virtue and vice.
So, God provides the map, but man drives the car. This places the onus of choice squarely on the human being, and that establishes the basis for justice.
Precisely. The justice of God requires man to have the freedom of choice. As Surah Al-Insan states, "Indeed, we guided him to the way, be he grateful or ungrateful." Reward and punishment would be unjust if choice did not exist.
Okay. Now, Shubhat 8 addresses the verses confirming God's absolute power to misguide, udil, or to harden hearts. How do we reconcile the idea that God wants guidance for all his command with his power to actively mislead his determination?
This is reconciled by distinguishing between the two fundamental categories of divine will, or irada.
What are they?
First, there is the legislative will, the irada sharia. This is what God desires and commands people to do. Guidance, faith, righteousness. This will encompasses his entire revealed law.
Okay, and the second?
Second, there is the cosmic or determining will, the irada kaniya qadariya. This is what God allows or determines to happen in the universe, regardless of whether he legislatively approves of it.
So this includes everything?
It includes all events, good or evil, guidance or misguidance, because everything that occurs is ultimately determined by him.
So, misguidance, Eilaaf, falls under the cosmic will. But if God determines it, how is it not coercion?
Because the scholarship emphasizes that God only enables or facilitates the misguidance for those who first choose deviation. Divine misguidance is understood as a consequence, not an arbitrary starting point. The verse in Surah Al-Alal illustrates this perfectly. God makes the path easy for the one who chooses goodness. We will ease him toward ease, yusra, and conversely, he eases the path toward difficulty for the one who chooses greed and denial. We will ease him toward hardship, usra.
So he facilitates the path that the servant willingly initiates. The servant takes the first step toward darkness, and God, through the cosmic will, facilitates that journey.
And that affirms justice, because the individual is responsible for the initial choice.
That is the mechanism of divine justice in this context. It's also important to contrast this with Satan's role. Satan only invites dawah. He has no actual power, no sultan, to compel anyone to err.
That's right. As confirmed in Surah Ibrahim, Satan explicitly confesses on the Day of Judgment that he only called them, and they responded voluntarily.
This concept of God actively hardening hearts or enabling straying is another tension point found in comparative texts, according to the source material.
Indeed. The source cites verses illustrating this profound theological struggle elsewhere. For example, Isaiah asks, "O Lord, why have you made us stray from your ways and hardened our heart from your fear?"
And in Ezekiel
states, "And if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet."
These texts show that the immense difficulty in reconciling absolute divine sovereignty with human responsibility is a cross-scriptural challenge.
It is, and it forces theologians everywhere to develop sophisticated concepts like the two wills to deal with it.
Part 4 addresses claims concerning divine integrity, beginning with the act of the divine oath, or qasam. Critics argue that God taking an oath swearing by creation like the East and West is a human trait that implies limitation or a need for validation.
And the initial rebuttal is the same fundamental principle we've been discussing. A common name, like swearing, does not imply a common function or nature. God's oath is unique to his perfection and utterly unlike a creature's oath, which often implies fear or a need for an external witness.
So if it's not for external validation, what is the established theological purpose of God's oath?
Well, Ibn al-Qayyim outlines the purpose. God swears by himself, his attributes, or his great created signs, primarily for emphasis and affirmation.
I see.
The oath is used to validate major, often unseen, truths like the certainty of resurrection, the veracity of prophecy, or the importance of a particular command. And when God swears by a creation, like the running horses or the dawn, it elevates the status of that creation as one of his magnificent signs.
Linking the sign's greatness to the importance of the truth being affirmed.
Exactly. It's a rhetorical device for emphasizing truth.
And what about the comparative context regarding oaths in the cited texts?
The source notes that the Lord frequently takes oaths, including swearing by his own essence. You can find, "By myself I have sworn," says the Lord, in both Genesis and Isaiah.
Interesting.
Furthermore, the source points out that the New Testament contains internal textual contradictions regarding the legality of swearing, noting verses that forbid swearing by heaven or one's own head, while other passages affirm that swearing by God or his creation is common practice.
Highlighting an internal ambiguity on the matter.
Yes.
Okay, next we have to address two very serious claims regarding divine integrity and motives. We start with Shubha 6, the claim of divine inclination toward women, spouse, or child. This is based on a misinterpretation of Surah Al-Anbiya.
The verse states, "Had we intended to take a diversion law, we could have taken it from before us if we were to do so." The misinterpretation hinges entirely on the translation of that word, law.
So what is the core protected interpretation of this verse?
This verse is a powerful declaration of divine independence and a categorical rejection of the polytheistic concept that God took a consort or a son.
Specifically addressing the Christian claim.
Exactly. God clarifies that if he had wanted a companion or child a notion entirely inappropriate for his divinity, he is absolutely capable of choosing it from his presence, from before us, meaning his creation. But then the verse concludes with that conditional, if we were to do so, implying it is an impossibility for his nature.
And how do scholars interpret law, diversion, or amusement in this high theological context?
Scholars like Ibn Kathir and Al-Hassan interpret law here as a euphemism for a spouse, a wife, or a child. It's a linguistic device used to negate the concept of divine parentage or companionship,
Reinforcing the theological exoneration of God from the needs associated with procreation or dependence on companionship.
It is, and this aligns with numerous other verses that affirm absolute singularity. The denial of a spouse and child is a pillar of the theology cited in Al-An'am and Surah Al-Ikhlas, which directly refutes the doctrines of the Trinity and divine sonship.
How should he have a son when he has no consort? That's the one. Okay, this leads us to the most provocative claim in this section, Shubha 7, the assertion that God acts as a pimp or procurer, a callwood. This is derived from misinterpreting a verse about the Prophet Muhammad's wives and a statement by Isha.
Yes.
This requires extreme sensitivity and rigorous adherence to scholarly context.
This specific claim results from grossly misapplying two texts. The first is Surah Al-Ahzab, where the Prophet Muhammad offers his wives a choice.
What's the choice?
Either the comforts of the worldly life and a beautiful, respectable divorce, Sarahan Jamalan, or remaining with him for the higher spiritual reward of God in the hereafter.
What is the scholarly understanding of the intention behind this divine command to offer a choice?
Well, scholars like Ibn Kathir and Al-Qurtubi emphasize that this was a moment of profound spiritual testing and elevation. The verse demands the highest spiritual aspiration from the Prophet's household.
It serves to purify the intention of the wives.
Exactly. They must choose God and the Prophet over worldly adornment. The act of offering the choice is about spiritual nobility and testing, not some base arrangement.
And the second text is Aisha's famous statement, made in a context of domestic jealousy and high affection. I do not see your Lord, except that he hastens to satisfy your desire. Hawa.
This quote arose following a revelation that granted the Prophet leniency regarding his marital arrangements. Now, critics literalize Hawa as base carnal desire.
But that's not the scholarly interpretation.
Not at all. Scholars stress that in the context of the Prophet, who is divinely protected and who does not speak from his own desire, Hawa must be interpreted as his pleasure, his wish, or his satisfaction.
I see.
Aisha was expressing, perhaps with a kind of playful jealousy, the observation that God's legislative will seemed consistently aligned with the Prophet's high spiritual inclination and ease of duty. It reinforces his unique status, not a base motive.
The necessity of defining terms based on the recipient of the description, the Prophet in this case, is the critical element to refute the claim.
Absolutely. The formal methodology demands that the character and protected nature of the Prophet informs the interpretation of ambiguous words like Hawa.
Finally, we must look at the comparative tests cited by the source, which present equally challenging claims regarding divine command and morality, and we have to acknowledge the extreme sensitivity required here.
Yes. The source notes texts that critics could view as scandalous because they seem to mandate immoral behavior. This includes texts alleging that God commands the prophet Hosea to marry a woman of prostitution and have children of prostitution. It also cites verses implying God commands consumption of alcohol to the point of intoxication in the Song of Solomon.
And most strikingly, the commands regarding theft.
Yes. The command where God instructs the Israelites to steal silver and gold articles from the Egyptians upon their departure. Furthermore, the source sets a reference in Ezekiel, where God is depicted as having given the Israelites statutes that were not good and judgments by which they could not live.
This powerful comparative review demonstrates that theological critique concerning the moral nature of divine commands, or the attribution of potentially base actions, is a universal complex issue.
It's found across religious texts, and it reinforces why rigorous scholarly interpretation focused on divine perfection and justice is essential in all traditions.
We have completed a truly dense and demanding deep dive. We've examined how scholars respond to profound ambiguities in Scripture, from creaturely descriptions to questions of free will and divine integrity. To synthesize this complex material, what are the couple of portable concepts we must retain?
Well, I think we can distill this down to three non-negotiable theological principles. First, knowledge is contextual. The primary mechanism for resolving these shubhat is the consistent differentiation between the divine essence, the eternal divine attributes, the sifat, and the created things attributed to God out of honor or ownership, the idafa.
So you affirm the text while rigorously denying likeness.
Exactly. You avoid that anthropomorphic error, Tashi.
Okay, what's second?
Second, divine justice governs will. Claims that God compels immorality or misleads have to be interpreted through the lens of divine justice and the duality of his will.
His legislative will versus his cosmic will.
Correct. God's legislative will always commands guidance, while his cosmic will only facilitates the path of misguidance, idlah, for those who first choose deviation.
So God doesn't initiate the descent. He facilitates the choice made by the individual, thereby upholding accountability.
Precisely. And third, authenticity and rigor are non-negotiable. Many of the sensational claims we examine, whether it was the animal-shaped throne bearers, the dog anecdote, or the water of resurrection, are dismissed by scholars because the specific traditional reports they rest on are proven to be weak, fabricated, or contextually misapplied.
So rigorous scrutiny of textual authenticity is the foundation upon which sound interpretation is built.
It has to be.
It's clear that interpreting Scripture, especially regarding the divine, requires moving far beyond a simple surface reading. It demands sophisticated principles of context, authenticity, and that absolute requirement of divine transcendency. The sheer theological depth required to resolve these ambiguities shows why true scholarship is so essential to prevent profound theological errors.
And the formality and respect shown in the scholarly responses reveal a deliberate, centuries-long effort to protect the perfection of the Creator while remaining faithful to the revealed descriptive language.
As we close this session, I want to leave you, the learner, with a final thought to mull over. We've spent time analyzing how created things, like the she-camel or the Kaaba, can be elevated and specialized through that principle of divine attribution, idafa.
Yes.
So if the simplest analogies used to describe the divine carry such a heavy burden of interpretation, what deeper layers of understanding might be unlocked if we approach even the most mundane events in our lives, your daily sustenance, your health, your challenges, as manifestations of specialized divine attribution? What does it mean for your own life that your smallest actions of kindness, like visiting the sick, are attributed back to the master of the worlds?
A profound thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आज हम एक बहुत ही दिलचस्प और थोड़े पेचीदा मौजू में गहराई तक उतरने वाले हैं।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम। जी, ये मौजू ऐसा है जिस पर अक्सर सवालात उठाए जाते हैं।
बिल्कुल। हमारे सामने जो मवाद है वो इन सवालात के बारे में है जो अक्सर अल्लाह की ज़ात के हवाले से जहन में आते हैं। कुछ ऐसी बातें जो मजहबी किताबों में पढ़ने में कह सकते हैं कि बहुत अजीब लगती हैं।
और कभी-कभी परेशान कुन भी।
हाँ, परेशान कुन भी। इस मवाद का उन्वान है शुबहात फी हक़िल्लाह, यानी अल्लाह की ज़ात के बारे में कुछ गलत फहमियाँ या शुबहात।
और हमारा मकसद यहाँ ये वाज़े करना बहुत ज़रूरी है कि किसी भी अक़ीदे को सही या गलत साबित करना नहीं है,
नहीं,
बल्कि हम इस मवाद को एक गाइड के तौर पर इस्तेमाल करेंगे ये समझने के लिए कि मुसन्निफ इन मुश्किल सवालात को कैसे देखता है और
उनकी तशरीह कैसे करता है।
तो ये दरअसल ज़ुबान, इस्तारे और मायने की गहराई को समझने की एक कोशिश है।
बिल्कुल। चलें, तो आइए शुरू करते हैं। इस मवाद में जो पहला शुबा है वो शायद सबसे ज्यादा चौंका देने वाला है। ये दावा कि अल्लाह के पास एक कुत्ता है, ये बात सुनकर ही जहन में एक झटका सा लगता है। मुसन्निफ के मुताबिक ये शुबा एक रिवायत की बुनियाद पर उठाया जाता है।
जी, एक रिवायत जिसमें नबी अकरम सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम ने उतबा बिन अबी लहब के लिए एक बद्दुआ की थी।
हाँ, कि ए अल्लाह, इस पर अपने कुत्तों में से एक कुत्ता मुसल्लत कर दे।
और फिर तारीख में आता है कि एक शेर ने उसे फाड़ खाया।
तो अब सवाल ये है कि क्या इसका मतलब ये है कि अल्लाह के पास सचमुच के कुत्ते हैं?
यही सवाल है, और ये एक बेहतरीन नुक्ता आगाज है, क्योंकि ये हमें सीधा उस मवाद के मरकजी ख्याल तक ले जाता है।
अच्छा।
मुसन्निफ कहता है कि इस तरह की तमाम पेचीदा बातों को समझने के लिए एक मास्टर की है, एक बुनियादी उसूल।
एक बुनियादी उसूल?
जी, और वो उसूल है ज़बान को समझना, खास तौर पर अरबी ज़बान का एक उसूल जिसे इदाफा कहते हैं।
इदाफा यानी किसी चीज को अल्लाह की तरफ मंसूब करना?
बिल्कुल।
अच्छा, तो ये इदाफा या मंसूब करना, इसका क्या मतलब है? क्या आप इसे थोड़ा आसान अल्फाज में समझा सकती हैं?
जरूर। دیکھیں مواد کے مطابق جب بھی کوئی چیز اللہ کی طرف منسوب کی جاتی ہے تو ہمیں یہ دیکھنا پڑتا ہے کہ وہ کس حیثیت سے منسوب کی گئی ہے۔ اس کی دو بڑی قسمیں ہیں۔ پہلی قسم ہے اضافہ صفت۔ یہ وہ چیزیں ہیں جو اللہ کی ذات کا حصہ ہے، اس کی صفات ہیں، جیسے ہم کہتے ہیں اللہ کا علم یا اللہ کی قدرت۔
ٹھیک ہے، یہ تو سمجھ میں آتا ہے۔ یہ صفات اللہ سے جدا نہیں کی جا سکتی۔
بالکل۔ اور دوسری قسم، اور یہی یہاں سب سے اہم ہے، اسے کہتے ہیں اضافہ ملک و تشریف۔
ملک و تشریف
یعنی کسی چیز کو اللہ کی طرف اس لیے منسوب کرنا کہ وہ اس کی ملکیت ہے اور اسے عزت دی جا رہی ہے۔ وہ چیز اللہ کی ذات کا حصہ نہیں ہوتی،
بلکہ اس کی مخلوق ہوتی ہے۔
جی بالکل۔ اس کی بہترین مثالیں قرآن میں موجود ہیں، جیسے حضرت صالح کی اونٹنی کو ناقۃ اللہ یعنی اللہ کی اونٹنی کہا گیا۔
اچھا،
اب اس کا مطلب یہ تو نہیں تھا کہ وہ اونٹنی اللہ کی ذات کا کوئی حصہ تھی، نہیں، بلکہ یہ اس کی خاص اہمیت اور تقدس کو ظاہر کرنے کے لیے تھا۔
اور جیسے کعبہ کو بیت اللہ کہتے ہیں۔
بہترین مثال، بیت اللہ یعنی اللہ کا گھر۔
تو یہ بات ہے، یعنی اللہ کا گھر کا مطلب یہ نہیں کہ اللہ اس گھر میں رہتا ہے، بلکہ یہ کہ وہ گھر اللہ کے لیے خاص ہے، اس کی ملکیت ہے اور قابل احترام ہے۔ تو اس اصول کو اگر ہم اس روایت پر لاگو کریں؟
بالکل۔ تو مواد یہی کہتا ہے کہ جب نبی صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم نے قلاب اللہ یعنی اللہ کے کتوں کا ذکر کیا تو اس کا مطلب اللہ کے پیدا کردہ درندوں میں سے ایک طاقتور درندہ تھا جو اس کے حکم سے کام کرتا تھا،
یعنی وہ شیر۔
جی، یہاں کتے کو اللہ کی طرف منسوب کرنا اس درندے کی ہیبت اور اس کے اللہ کے عذاب کا ایک آلہ ہونے کو ظاہر کرتا ہے۔ یہ اضافہ ملک ہے، اضافہ صفت نہیں۔
یہ تو بہت دلچسپ وضاحت ہے۔
ویسے ایک اور بہت اہم بات جو مصنف نے لکھی ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ محدثین کے نزدیک سند کے اعتبار سے یہ روایت ضعیف جداً ہے۔
ضعیف جداً یعنی انتہائی ناقابل اعتبار۔
جی،
تو اسے ہم اس طرح سمجھ سکتے ہیں کہ جیسے کسی تاریخی واقعے کی خبر تو ہو لیکن اس کے راوی قابل اعتبار نہ ہوں تو مورخین اسے سنجیدگی سے نہیں لیتے۔
آپ نے بالکل صحیح نقطہ پکڑا۔
تو اس دلیل کی دو سطحیں ہیں۔ پہلی یہ کہ اگر روایت کو مان بھی لیا جائے تو اس کا مطلب استعاراتی ہے، اور دوسری یہ کہ روایت خود ہی مستند نہیں۔
بالکل یہی بات ہے، اور یہی ماسٹر کی یعنی اضافت کے اصول کو سمجھنا دوسرے شبہات کو حل کرنے میں بھی مدد دیتا ہے۔
جیسے کہ عرش کے بارے میں ایک شبہ ہے جس کا ذکر اس مواد میں ہے، کہا جاتا ہے کہ اسے جانور اٹھائے ہوئے ہیں۔ یہ بھی اسی نوعیت کی بات لگتی ہے۔
جی، قرآن تو واضح طور پر کہتا ہے کہ عرش کو 8 فرشتے اٹھائے ہوئے ہیں۔
ہاں،
لیکن کچھ کمزور روایات میں ان فرشتوں کی شکلیں بیل، شیر یا عقاب جیسی بیان کی گئی ہیں، جس سے یہ غلط فہمی پیدا ہوئی کہ شاید یہ جانور ہیں۔
اچھا۔
مصنف ان روایات کو بھی ضعیف یا منکر یعنی مسترد شدہ قرار دیتا ہے۔ یہاں بھی جب عرش ربک یعنی تیرے رب کا عرش کہا جاتا ہے تو مقصد اس عرش کی عظمت اور اللہ سے اس کے خاص تعلق کو ظاہر کرنا ہوتا ہے
کہ وہ اس کی مخلوق ہے، لیکن سب سے عظیم مخلوقات میں سے ایک۔
بالکل۔
اب میں اس اصول کی اہمیت سمجھ رہا ہوں۔ یہ تو ایک طرح سے سوچ کا زاویہ ہی بدل دیتا ہے۔ لیکن کچھ باتیں اس سے بھی زیادہ ذاتی اور عجیب لگتی ہیں۔ مثلاً مواد میں ایک حدیث قدسی کا ذکر ہے جس کی بنیاد پر یہ شبہ اٹھایا جاتا ہے کہ اللہ بیمار ہوتا ہے، بھوکا ہوتا ہے، پیاسا ہوتا ہے۔
جی، یہ حدیث بہت گہری ہے۔
حدیث میں اللہ کہتا ہے، اے ابن آدم، میں بیمار ہوا تو تو نے میری عیادت نہیں کی۔ یہ تو سیدھا سیدھا انسانی تجربہ اللہ سے منسوب کیا جا رہا ہے۔
یہاں بھی زبان کا استعاراتی حسن کام کر رہا ہے۔ مواد ہمیں بتاتا ہے کہ ہمیں حدیث کو پورا پڑھنا چاہیے۔
اچھا۔
جب انسان حیرت سے پوچھتا ہے کہ اے میرے رب، تو رب العالمین ہے، میں تیری عیادت کیسے کرتا، تو اللہ خود اس کی وضاحت کرتا ہے۔
کیا وضاحت کرتا ہے؟
وہ فرماتا ہے، کیا تجھے معلوم نہیں کہ میرا فلاں بندہ بیمار تھا اور تو نے اس کی عیادت نہیں کی؟ اگر تو اس کی عیادت کرتا تو مجھے اس کے پاس پاتا۔
اچھا، مجھے اس کے پاس پاتا، اس کا کیا مطلب ہے؟
اس کا مطلب اللہ کا جسمانی طور پر وہاں موجود ہونا نہیں ہے،
پھر
بلکہ اس کی رحمت، اس کی رضا اور اس کے اجر کا قریب ہونا ہے۔ یہ اپنے نیک اور مصیبت زدہ بندے سے انتہائی قربت، محبت اور ہمدردی کا اظہار ہے۔
یعنی یہ بتانے کا ایک انتہائی پراسر طریقہ ہے کہ ایک بیمار انسان کی خدمت کرنا اللہ کے نزدیک کتنا بڑا عمل ہے۔
بالکل، اور اسی طرح بھوک اور پیاس کے بارے میں بھی حدیث میں آگے یہی وضاحت ہے کہ اگر تو اسے کھلاتا تو اس کا اجر میرے پاس پاتا۔
لیکن اس سے ایک سوال پیدا ہوتا ہے،
جی،
اگر مطلب صرف بندے سے محبت کا اظہار تھا تو اتنا چونکا دینے والا انداز کیوں اپنایا گیا؟ میں بیمار ہوا، کیا اس سے غلط فہمی پیدا ہونے کا خطرہ نہیں تھا؟
بہت اچھا سوال ہے۔ مواد اس پر براہ راست تو بات نہیں کرتا، لیکن اس اسلوب بیان سے یہ نتیجہ اخذ کیا جا سکتا ہے کہ اس کا مقصد بات کی شدت اور اہمیت کو سننے والے کے دل میں اتارنا ہے۔ جب کوئی بات چونکا دینے والے انداز میں کہی جاتی ہے تو وہ زیادہ یاد رہتی ہے، اس کا اثر گہرا ہوتا ہے۔ یہ انسان کو جھنجھوڑنے کے لیے ہے کہ جس چیز کو تم معمولی سمجھ رہے ہو،
یعنی کسی بیمار کی عیادت،
ہاں، وہ میرے نزدیک اتنی اہم ہے کہ گویا تم نے میری خدمت کی۔ یہ زبان کا ایک ادبی کمال ہے۔
تو اب تک ہم نے جو اصول سمجھا وہ زبان، اضافت اور استعارے سے متعلق تھا۔
جی،
یعنی اللہ کی ذات کے بارے میں جب کوئی بظاہر انسانی بات کی جائے تو اس کا گہرا مطلب کیسے تلاش کیا جائے؟ لیکن یہی الجھن تب بھی پیدا ہوتی ہے جب اللہ کے کاموں یعنی اس کے افعال کا ذکر آتا ہے،
جیسے علم، ارادہ اور ہدایت دینا۔
بالکل، مواد اس میدان میں ہماری کیسے رہنمائی کرتا ہے؟
یہ گفتگو کا دوسرا اور شاید زیادہ پیچیدہ حصہ ہے۔
اچھا،
یہاں معاملہ اللہ کی ذات سے ہٹ کر اس کے افعال اور کائنات کے ساتھ اس کے تعلق پر آ جاتا ہے، اور اس میں سب سے پہلا شبہ اللہ کے علم غیب سے متعلق ہے۔
یہ میں نے بھی پڑھا ہے۔ مواد میں کچھ قرآنی آیات کا حوالہ دیا گیا ہے، جیسے لِیَعْلَمُ اللَّهُ، جس کا لفظی ترجمہ ہے تاکہ اللہ جان لے۔ اس سے یہ تاثر ملتا ہے کہ معاذ اللہ کو پہلے علم نہیں تھا اور کسی واقعے کے بعد اسے علم ہوا۔ یہ تو عقیدے کی بنیاد پر ہی سوال کھڑا کر دیتا ہے۔
بالکل، اور یہ بہت سنگین غلط فہمی ہے۔ مواد اس کی تشریح یوں کرتا ہے کہ اللہ کا علم ازلی اور ابدی ہے، یعنی ایسا کوئی لمحہ نہیں تھا جب وہ کچھ نہیں جانتا تھا اور بعد میں جاننے لگا۔
وہ ہمیشہ سے سب کچھ جانتا ہے۔
جی، تو پھر ان آیات کا کیا مطلب ہے؟ اس کے لیے مواد ایک بہت خوبصورت مثال پیش کرتا ہے۔
وہ کیا؟
اسے یوں سمجھیں کہ ایک استاد کو پہلے ہی دن معلوم ہوتا ہے کہ کون سا طالب علم محنتی ہے اور کون سا نہیں، لیکن وہ پھر بھی امتحان لیتا ہے۔
صحیح۔
امتحان کا مقصد استاد کا جاننا نہیں ہوتا، کیونکہ وہ تو پہلے ہی جانتا ہے۔ امتحان کا مقصد طالب علم کے عمل کو ظاہر کرنا ہوتا ہے، اسے سب کے سامنے لے آنا ہوتا ہے
کہ نتیجے کی بنیاد انصاف پر ہو۔
بالکل، یہی نقطہ ہے۔ یہ تو بہت واضح مثال ہے، یعنی علم کے حصول کے لیے نہیں، علم کے ظہور کے لیے ہوتا ہے۔
اچھا،
مواد کے مطابق جب قرآن کہتا ہے تاکہ اللہ جان لے، تو اس کا مطلب یہ نہیں ہوتا کہ اللہ کو علم حاصل ہو، بلکہ اس کا مطلب ہوتا ہے کہ اللہ اپنے ازلی علم کو دنیا میں ظاہر کر دے، اسے وقوع پذیر کر دے۔ وہ ایسے حالات پیدا کرتا ہے جن میں انسان کا کھرا کھوٹا ظاہر ہو جاتا ہے، تاکہ جب قیامت کے دن فیصلہ ہو تو کسی کے پاس یہ عذر نہ ہو کہ مجھے تو موقع ہی نہیں ملا تھا۔ یہ مخلوق پر حجت قائم کرنا ہے۔
اس سے جڑا ہوا ایک اور بہت بڑا اور شاید سب سے زیادہ پوچھا جانے والا سوال ہے
ہدایت اور گمراہی کا۔
جی، اور وہ ہے ہدایت اور گمراہی کا۔ قرآن میں کئی جگہ آیا ہے کہ اللہ جسے چاہتا ہے گمراہ کرتا ہے اور جسے چاہتا ہے ہدایت دیتا ہے۔ اگر اللہ ہی گمراہ کر رہا ہے تو پھر انسان کا کیا قصور؟ یہ تو آزاد مرضی یا فری ول کے تصور کے خلاف جاتا ہے۔
یہ واقعی ایک بہت بڑا اور حساس سوال ہے۔ مواد اس کی وضاحت اللہ کے دو طرح کے ارادوں میں فرق کر کے کرتا ہے۔
دو طرح کے ارادے؟
جی، ایک ہے ارادہ شرعیہ، لیجسلیٹو ول، یعنی وہ چیزیں جن کا اللہ نے حکم دیا ہے اور جن سے وہ خوش ہوتا ہے، جیسے ایمان، نیکی، سچائی۔ وہ چاہتا ہے کہ سب لوگ ہدایت پائیں۔
ٹھیک ہے۔
دوسرا ہے ارادہ کونیہ، یونیورسل ول، یعنی وہ چیزیں جن کے ہونے کی وہ اجازت دیتا ہے، چاہے وہ اسے پسند ہو یا نہ ہو۔ دنیا میں جو کچھ بھی ہو رہا ہے، اچھا یا برا، وہ اسی ارادہ کونیہ کے تحت ہو رہا ہے۔
میں سمجھ رہا ہوں، لیکن ایک عام سننے والے کے لیے یہ بات ہضم کرنا مشکل ہو سکتا ہے۔ کیا اس کا مطلب یہ ہے کہ جب کوئی برا کام کرتا ہے تو وہ بھی اللہ کے ارادے سے ہوتا ہے؟
مواد کے مطابق ہاں، اس کے ارادہ کونیہ یعنی اس کی اجازت سے ہوتا ہے۔ لیکن اس کے ارادہ شرعیہ یعنی اس کے حکم اور اس کی رضا سے نہیں ہوتا۔
اچھا، یہ فرق اہم ہے۔
بہت اہم۔ اس کی وجہ یہ ہے کہ اللہ نے انسان کو انتخاب کی آزادی دی ہے۔ قرآن میں واضح کہا گیا فمن شاء فلیؤمن ومن شاء فلیکفر،
بس جو چاہے ایمان لائے اور جو چاہے کفر کرے۔
جی، تو جب کوئی شخص اپنے اختیار سے گمراہی کا راستہ چنتا ہے تو اللہ اسے زبردستی ہدایت کی طرف نہیں کھینچتا، وہ اسے اس کے حال پر چھوڑ دیتا ہے اور کائنات کے اصولوں کے تحت اس کے لیے وہی راستہ آسان ہو جاتا ہے جو اس نے خود چنا ہے۔
اور اسی کو اللہ کا گمراہ کرنا کہا گیا ہے۔
بالکل، یہ سزا کے طور پر ہوتا ہے، پہل کے طور پر نہیں۔
اچھا، تو یہ گمراہی بندے کے اپنے انتخاب کا نتیجہ ہوتی ہے، اور اللہ کا گمراہ کرنا دراصل اس انتخاب کے نتیجے کو وقوع پذیر ہونے دینا ہے۔
جی، مواد یہی نقطہ نظر پیش کرتا ہے۔ اسی سے جڑی ایک اور آیت ہے جس پر شبہ کیا جاتا ہے۔
کون سی؟
فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا،
پس اس نے نفس کو اس کی برائی اور پرہیزگاری کا الہام کیا۔
ہاں، یہ بھی ایک اہم نقطہ ہے۔ الہام کا مطلب تو یہی لگتا ہے کہ دل میں بات ڈالنا۔
مصنف یہاں الہام کے معنی کی وسعت کی طرف توجہ دلاتا ہے۔
اچھا، اکثر مفسرین جن کا حوالہ مواد میں ہے اس کا مطلب یہ لیتے ہیں کہ اللہ نے انسان کی فطرت میں نیکی اور بدی کی پہچان اور ان دونوں کے درمیان تمیز کرنے کی صلاحیت رکھ دی ہے۔
یہ حکم نہیں ہے بلکہ پہچان ہے۔
بالکل، جیسے آپ کے اندر یہ صلاحیت ہے کہ آپ سچ اور جھوٹ میں فرق کر سکیں، تو اللہ نے نفس کو یہ سمجھا دیا، اس کی فطرت میں یہ بات ڈال دی کہ یہ فجور یعنی برائی ہے اور یہ تقوی یعنی پرہیزگاری ہے، اور پھر اسے اختیار دے دیا کہ وہ کیا چنتا ہے۔
یہ رہنمائی ہے، زبردستی نہیں۔
جی،
بہت خوب۔ اب ہم اس گفتگو کے آخری حصے کی طرف آتے ہیں۔ ایک آخری شبہ جس کا ذکر مواد میں ہے وہ اللہ کی طرف قسم کھانے کو منسوب کرنا ہے۔ قرآن میں اللہ نے اپنی اور اپنی مخلوقات کی بہت قسمیں کھائی ہیں۔ اعتراض یہ ہے کہ قسم کھانا تو ایک انسانی عمل ہے جو اپنی بات میں وزن پیدا کرنے کے لیے کیا جاتا ہے۔ کیا یہ اللہ کی شان کے خلاف نہیں؟
یہاں مواد ہمیں پھر سے ایک بنیادی اصول کی طرف واپس لاتا ہے۔
کون سا؟
ناموں کا ایک جیسا ہونا حقیقت کے ایک جیسے ہونے کو لازم نہیں کرتا۔
اچھا، یعنی ایک ہی لفظ جب انسان کے لیے استعمال ہو تو اس کا مطلب اور ہوتا ہے، اور جب اللہ کے لیے
تو اس کا مطلب اور ہوتا ہے۔ بالکل، جیسے انسان بھی دیکھتا ہے اور اللہ بھی دیکھتا ہے، لیکن دونوں کے دیکھنے میں زمین آسمان کا فرق ہے۔
صحیح۔ انسان آنکھوں سے دیکھتا ہے، محدود دیکھتا ہے،
اور اللہ کا دیکھنا اس کی شان کے لائق ہے، لامحدود اور کامل۔
تو اسی اصول کے تحت انسان کی قسم اور اللہ کی قسم میں بھی فرق ہے۔
بالکل، انسان قسم کھاتا ہے کیونکہ وہ کمزور ہے اور اسے اپنی بات کو سچا ثابت کرنے کے لیے سہارے کی ضرورت ہوتی ہے۔
ٹھیک ہے۔
لیکن مواد کے مطابق جب اللہ قسم کھاتا ہے تو اس کا مقصد اپنی سچائی ثابت کرنا نہیں ہوتا، کیونکہ وہ تو سب سے سچا ہے۔
تو پھر مقصد کیا ہوتا ہے؟
اس کا مقصد مخاطب یعنی انسان پر اس بات کی اہمیت، عظمت اور تاکید کو واضح کرنا ہوتا ہے۔
اچھا،
جب اللہ سورج کی، چاند کی یا اپنی ذات کی قسم کھا کر کوئی بات کہتا ہے تو وہ دراصل انسان کو یہ بتا رہا ہوتا ہے کہ اس بات کو معمولی مت سمجھنا، یہ اتنی ہی اہم اور یقینی ہے جتنی یہ عظیم چیزیں جن کی میں قسم کھا رہا ہوں۔
تو یہ ایک اسلوب بیان ہے جو بات کے وزن کو بڑھانے کے لیے۔
جی بالکل۔
آج کی اس گفتگو کو اگر سمیٹا جائے تو اس کا خلاصہ یہ ہے کہ اس مواد کے مطابق مذہبی متون کو سمجھتے ہوئے ہمیں لفظوں کے ظاہری خول میں قید نہیں ہو جانا چاہیے۔ زبان کے استعاراتی اسلوب، سیاق و سباق اور تشریح کے وہ اصول جو صدیوں سے علماء نے وضع کیے ہیں، ان کو مد نظر رکھنا انتہائی ضروری ہے۔
بالکل، بظاہر نظر آنے والے تضادات یا انسانی صفات دراصل گہرے معنی کی حامل ہوتی ہیں،
جن کا مقصد اللہ کی عظمت، اس کے بندوں سے محبت یا اس کے انصاف کو بیان کرنا ہوتا ہے۔
آپ نے بالکل درست کہا۔ اور سامعین کے لیے ایک آخری سوچ، یہ مواد ہمیں دکھاتا ہے کہ عقائد کی تفہیم ایک مسلسل فکری سفر ہے۔
یہ کوئی جامد چیز نہیں ہے کہ بس ایک بار سمجھ لی اور ختم۔
نہیں، ایک اہم سوال جو اس پوری بحث سے پیدا ہوتا ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ جب ہم قدیم مذہبی متون اور الہی تصورات کا مطالعہ کرتے ہیں تو لفظی معنی اور مجازی معنی کے درمیان حد کہاں کھینچی جائے؟
اور اس بات کا تعین کون کرتا ہے کہ کون سی تشریح درست ہے اور کون سی نہیں؟
یہی وہ سوال ہے جو ہر دور میں اہل علم کے لیے غور و فکر کا مرکز رہا ہے، اور آج کے دور میں جب معلومات کا سیلاب ہے، اس کی اہمیت شاید پہلے سے بھی کہیں زیادہ ہے۔